Hello, everyone. Thanks for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I'm here with.
Lynne Hardy, the line editor for the upcoming Rivers of London role-playing game and the associate editor for Call of Cthulhu role-playing game.
And speaking of Call of Cthulhu, we're going to talk about something that was published about 2 years ago, I would say, approximately. Children of Fear. A very epic Call of Cthulhu campaign from Chaosium. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. So I figured this, since the book has been out for some time now, I wanted to talk to you about keeper tips. Now, I'm sure you've heard questions from players and other keepers. I'm sure you have some thoughts about it afterwards. But before we get into that, if I may ask, how did this book exactly come about? I felt that this topic was. I love the setting. I'm just curious, how did Chaosium decide? Okay, let's focus on this.
It's one of those shaggy dog stories, Manny. And it was one that kind of came about almost by accident in some ways. Um, Before I came to work for Chaosium, obviously I'd worked for Modiphius. I was the lead writer and line editor for the Acton Cthulhu Kickstarter project for Modiphius. And as part of that, I wrote the world-spanning campaign that was Shadows of Atlantis. And I'd got so many notes that I really wanted to use some of the ones that hadn't been used about India, Tibet, that kind of an area, because it's fascinating historically and mythologically. And there's some really great places there and locations that, in my mind, I thought would be great to use as backdrops for Call of Cthulhu scenarios or another Call of Cthulhu campaign. Now, this was all around the time that Moon Design took over Chaosium. And I happened to be at Gen Con that year, and the new owners of Chaosium were there at Gen Con that year. And as it so happened, the Chaosium booth was over the other side of the aisle to the Modiphius booth. So I knew I kind of probably should go and say hi, because obviously everything I'd done for Acton Cthulhu had been sent to Mike Mason for review to make sure that everything was okay. So I had a working relationship with Mike, but I knew some of the new owners through years of attending gaming conventions, but I was a bit shy about it. And my good friend Robin Laws was there, and I went to see him, and he basically said, point blank, "Have you been to see the new owners of Chaosium yet?" And I sort of did my usual dithering, shy British person thing, and Robin route marched me straight back over to the Chaosium stand, introduced me to Jeff Richards. I won't say what he said because there's a bleepy word in it, but then I ended up sitting down at a table with Jeff discussing ideas for not a world-spanning campaign, but an epic campaign set in the northern India, Tibet region. I then went away, did some more research, wrote a brief. That brief then went to Mike, who went over it with me, and it was refined even further. And it became very obvious that what I thought the campaign was going to be wasn't what it wanted to be, because certain things kept coming up in the research, certain themes, which we can't really mention because obviously that would massive spoilers for what's going on in the book. So it got refined into something completely different. So basically, most of the research that I'd hoped to use from Shadows of Atlantis still never got used because Children of Fear decided it wanted to be its own thing.
There are two things about this book that I think I've come across other keepers and other players asking about. And I think as much as they love the setting, to some keepers, it's very new to them. This not just this side of the world in general, but this side of the world during this time period. So I wanted to ask if anyone that maybe needs some more like a visual, something visual to kind of understand the setting better. Are there any maybe books or movies or something that they can watch and prepare ahead of time as they're opening up this book?
It is a region of the world that we're not expecting Chaosium's Western audience to necessarily be familiar with. And to be fair, that was one of the reasons why we chose it, because it isn't an area that Chaosium itself has particularly explored as far as Call of Cthulhu goes. And that was as much to surprise the players as it was to surprise their investigators. But yes, it is an unusual place. That's why we have the What Your Investigator Knows handouts in there, because that was certainly the feedback that came back from playtest, was that we don't really know that much about some of these places now, let alone in the 1920s. So that was there. I'm just going to double check the resources in the back of the
Mm,
book, because this is why I like to have a resource section at the back.
mm,
Because yeah, it is a very strange place, and it is a very different place to those who are used to running um, campaigns in Europe or Egypt or Lovecraft country, basically. So, in terms of films, one of my absolute favorites is Black Narcissus by Powell and Pressburger. So, this is amazing, lush Technicolor movie from the 1940s. So it's a little bit later, but it's a very good film for getting the atmosphere of isolation and creeping dread. And it's basically about a bunch of nuns who take over a monastery high up in the Himalayas on the Indian side of the border. Like you said, if you want an absolute masterclass in how to create slow building dread, it's really an amazing film to watch. Some fantastic performances in there. There are a couple of good TV series if you can track them down. There's one called In Search of Myths and Heroes, The Search for Shangri-La, which was a BBC or an ITV one, if I remember right. So that can be found on streaming services sometimes. You've got things like there was a TV series called The Silk Road, which was very useful. Again, I think that was a BBC one. There's two documentary series called The Story of China and The Story of India, which are well worth digging out if you can find them. There's an amazing Tibetan film called Soul on a String, which again kind of digs into Tibetan mythology, and it's very good at evoking a sense of place and mystery. In terms of books, you really can't go wrong with anything by Peter Hopkirk or Charles Allen on India and Tibet. They've done a lot of writing about it, and they're very easy and accessible books. They're great to read. If you want some genuine original source material, then anything by Alexandra David Nael, who was the woman who snuck her way into Lhasa in the 1920s. And they are fascinating books. They were written after the fact, quite a few years after the fact, but again, well worth going and having a look for. But
mm.
anything that really you can find on the history of China, the history of India, or the history of Tibet, particularly those regions. There's also a really useful podcast called Why We Love Dunhuang, which is running on Spotify and various other platforms at the moment, which gives you a lot of history about the Silk Road and one of the locations in particular throughout history, which may well also be useful for keepers.
Hmm. And the second thing I come across from other keepers is that, well, I'm trying not to be spoilery, but let's just say the Subterfuge. Do you have any?
Yes.
Now, my players are a little bit too smart. I've noticed. So I have to be really, really careful if I'm trying to be sneaky. Do you have any tips or suggestions about keepers being as sneaky as they can be?
I think the best tip I can probably give is it's all to do with building tension. Obviously, you do need to be sneaky. There's quite a lot, and the idea of the campaign is that it's this slow build of probably confusion to start with, because what on earth is going on, and then this growing feeling of not everything is right, and then this slow build-up of dread that everything seems to be arrayed against them. But I mean, if your players are smart, lean into it. See if they can battle against the odds to deal with the issue. So yes, be as sneaky as you can be, but don't be worried if your players do figure it out and do decide to take action. The whole point of this is that you and your players are meant to have fun solving the mystery, taking care of the issues. And if they happen to work out quite early on what's going on, then that just means that, you know, you wrap things up slightly more quickly. But thankfully, there are one or two extra bits in the book that, you know, you can pull out and you can use as standalone adventures. So hopefully, even if they do figure it out quite fast and you do resolve slightly more quickly than you're anticipating, there's still lots of material, lots of ideas in there for you to have other adventures going on in that area. That makes sense?
Oh yes, yes.
You see,
So
say it's very hard to talk about being sneaky without giving massive plot spoilers for this one.
yeah, it is difficult. And I and readers, viewers, if you're hearing this, you should definitely, if you're enjoying the Call of Cthulhu books, you haven't picked this up, you really should. There's some really good twists and turns in this book. Now this book's been out for maybe close to 2 years now since it's been printed. Have you received any like interesting questions, that reoccurring questions from readers from the book?
Quite often is how do you fit it in amongst other campaigns? I deliberately wrote it so that it all takes place before Masks of Nyarlathotep. Now, I know that the general company line, or at least certainly Mike's line and also mine as well, to a very large extent, is that each of the campaigns kind of take place in their own little pocket universe. So, you know, if things go hideously wrong in Children of Fear, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't then just go to Masks of Nyarlathotep, because that's a different trouser leg of time that just got totally annihilated. There's still this other one over here that you can go and do masks in. But I did try to make sure that it took place before that, so that if you did want to run them contiguously, it meant that basically your plays were at least in vaguely the right part of the world to start getting pulled in to some of the later chapters. I mean, it would take a little bit of work to sort of like start masks in the nearest location, but it wouldn't necessarily be impossible. And of course, depending on, you know, there are political events going on in certain of the regions that do make it very difficult to move the time of the campaign, but you certainly can if you want to. So that if you've already run masks, technically you could actually run Children of Fear after it. You just have to cheat with the history. But then this is a game, and it doesn't really matter if you cheat with the history to a certain extent, because it's got dirty great Cthulhuid monsters in it, magic and stuff like that.
Hmm. So for those that have played this adventure and want to continue in this setting, maybe they want to jump into another Call of Cthulhu adventure, but they still want to explore this part of the world some more. Are there any thoughts or suggestions of how to do so? Are there certain adventure seeds you would recommend?
Well, obviously you've got Dr. Pyra Mal, who is in the area. He's a real person. He actually existed. He worked for the Wellcome Trust, which was Wellcome's basic way of going around collecting medical paraphernalia from all around the world, and as well as a whole load of other stuff. So, I mean, if there's anywhere out in that region that you fancy exploring, having Pyra Mal basically go, oh, the Wellcome Trust has charged me to find X, you know, you've got your perfect lead in for someone who can act as an adventure dispenser effectively. And that's one of the reasons why he's also in the rule book as well, in Children of Fear, is so that, you know, if anything happens, he knows the right people who could potentially become investigators for you. So why not use him as a scenario dispenser? There's lots of little things that get mentioned. Obviously, you've got the various different cities. If you like and are interested by certain of the cities that the characters visit, then do a little bit of research on them. As I mentioned, when you research these things, you end up with copious notes. There are so many cool, weird things going on in all of the places that are visited that I never got to include in this book. So go and have a look. Websites, travel guides, you name it, there will be something there that is really weird that you can twist very easily to actually make it a Cthulhu adventure. There are one or two other books in the pipeline, but I can't really talk about them they're from licensees and various other people, but I'm not sure they've actually been announced yet. So,
what's great about Call of Cthulhu books is that sometimes the setting is almost like an NPC in a sort of way. I think we know that history can be very horrible, and it is very horrible actually. But how do you have any tips about setting as a living character in your game, using it that way?
as you say, that the history of this particular part of the world that this campaign is set in is thousands and thousands of years old. You have it touches on some tremendously ancient civilizations, some of which are still with us, some of which aren't. It touches on three massive empires. So it touches on the British Empire, the Chinese Empire, and the Russian Empire. And everybody trying to do massive land grabs in Central Asia and gain control of that entire region. So if your characters like political intrigue, there's no reason why you can't get them involved in that as well. I mean, there were huge spy networks all over the area because China wanted Tibet, Russia wanted Tibet and northern India. Britain, let's face it, wanted pretty much everything that was and wasn't nailed down. And there were some real seriously dubious things going on in that area in terms of international espionage. It was called The Great Game. Another film, if you can find it, actually is the film Kim from 1950, which stars a very young Dean Stockwell and Errol Flynn, which is based on Rudyard Kipling's book of the same name, which is all about espionage in that region of the world and The Great Game. So, you can really skew things towards being almost like a spy thriller if you really want to. Obviously, you've still got huge amounts of exploration going on in that part of the world. The 1920s was a big time for people trying to get into Tibet because it was a closed country. Nobody was allowed in there on pain of death, except with British permission by this point. So, if you really want to look at exploration history, you can bring that in and you can effectively take the scenic route and use that to have that history to help fuel and enrich your games. Obviously, if you want to examine colonialism, you can do that too. But every group's mileage is going to vary massively on that. And that's why there is guidance in Children of Fear about dealing with it. Because, the situation in British India was horrendous. There was gigantic amounts of racism. And not every group is going to want to deal with that in their game because it may well be their lived experience every day of their lives and they want their game to be something away from that. But it's there if groups want to look at it, want to examine it, as long as they do so respectfully. Because obviously this is real history that still has repercussions to this day.
Mm. Well, that leads to my next question. If this book was studied in colleges, what themes do you hope that they can learn from Children of Fear?
Exploration broadens the mind, for a start. Everywhere you go, every person you meet has something to teach you. Yours is not the only worldview, yours is not the only outlook. There are fabulous things out there that you can find. I think I would also like it to spark curiosity about things that you don't particularly know. I love learning about new things, and that was one of my aims for this book, was to introduce places that people might not have been so familiar with, and they would enjoy learning about them. But yeah, I think basically it's the fact that there is so much out there that you can learn, and you should never close your mind to those opportunities. Would be the main thing that I would hope would be looked at. I would also hope actually that they could be used as a springboard to discuss the history and colonialism and issues like that, because obviously with this being a historical game, particularly in the 1920s, sometimes that in the past has been glossed over when we've, things have gone down more of a pulp route. And I think we just need to be a little bit more aware that there are, history holds some very dark secrets. It's not just all running in there, reading out the ritual and slapping Cthulhu on the nose and living to fight another day kind of thing.
Hmm. If I was running this game and you were one of my players, one of my investigators, what character would you play?
Ooh, it's probably going to have to be an archaeologist, really. Because again, there's massive amounts of archaeological exploration going on in this period of time in that region, or possibly a paleontologist, because you're quite close to the Gobi Desert at this point, and they're starting to make all sorts of interesting discoveries of dinosaurs at that point in the Gobi Desert. And again, you have to look at that with a critical eye, because let's face it, the Western archaeologists were busily just going into this region and stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. So, while it's fun to play, you always have to be aware of what was actually going on historically at this region, in this region, with people like Orpelio, Langdon Warner, and Mark Orlstein, just basically going in, paying coppers for stuff and taking cartloads of priceless artifacts away from their areas of origin, just to stock Western museums basically and satisfy Western benefactors.
Will there ever be a Children of Fear Part 2? Do you see a sequel in the sometime?
No, I don't, largely because I've written 2 large campaigns on my own for Call of Cthulhu now. I've also written large campaigns on my own for other game systems, and I really just need someone to stop me next time I even vaguely suggest doing something that stupid. Obviously they take a lot of time and a lot of work. I mean, this one took 5 years roughly from start to finish. It shouldn't have taken quite that long, but there was this big almost 2-year period in the middle where I was working on Masks of Nyarlathotep, which kind of derailed things somewhat. But they are a lot of work on your own. And the climate has changed since I started writing this. And let's put it this way, there are other people out there who are better for writing scenarios in this part of the world than I am.
Is there any final thoughts, anything that I haven't asked about that you want to share about this book?
It was a lovely story from Chaosium Con. There was a gentleman came up to me and introduced himself, and basically said, "Oh, hello, I'm a professor of Tibetan Buddhism," and I wanted to hide under the sofa at that point in time, because it was like, oh heck, here we go. And he actually thanked me for having, got most of it right, and having done a sympathetic portrayal and tried to be as authentic as I possibly could. And that was very much down to help and assistance that I received from 2 ordained Tibetan Buddhists who had gone over the entire manuscript for me to make sure that I hadn't done anything egregious, because obviously this does touch on real world religions, and you need to make sure that you're doing that sensitively and respectfully. Not a particularly religious person, but that does not give me the right to go trampling over other people's faiths just to tell a story. So I was very relieved that people who are experts in these areas think that we did a good and sympathetic job, and that's good to know, because the last thing I want to do is cause offense to anybody because I've misunderstood something.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hardy, for taking the time to talk to us about Children of Fear. I enjoy very much what I really love about the Call of Cthulhu books. I mean, as much as they're fun to play, is that you always learn something. Every setting that they put out, you learn something that kind of afterwards you stop and read it like, okay, I really want to know more what's happening here, more of the context of what's going on. Where did it lead to? How's that what happened then affected things now? So yes, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
You're very welcome. And I'm glad that's how you feel about it, because that's kind of, obviously these aren't meant to be travel guides,
Mm.
but they are meant to spark your imagination so that you do go off and find interesting other places nearby, not too far away, that you can set your own adventures in. And if they're doing that, then great, we've done our job.
Mm. So viewers, I will put a link in the description below. If this is your first time hearing about Children of Fear, this is put a link, check it out. You'll definitely enjoy it. And everyone out there, be safe, take care. We'll see you soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.